Welcome to Season 5 of Learning Unlocked. I'm your host, Britt Bingold. As an instructional specialist in Gilbert, Arizona, I'm a total nerd when it comes to classroom strategies and educational pedagogy. Educators are the key holders to unlocking learning for students. Today, my goal is to provide you with resources and tools, the keys, to enable and accelerate learning for all students. Thanks for joining me today. Let's get started. Before we get going today, I just wanted to do a quick reminder that if you have time to rate us and write us a review on Apple Podcasts, we would appreciate it. The more reviews and ratings we get, the more educators will see and hear our podcast. So if you like what you're hearing and you think others would too, please head over and provide us a review. Thanks. Welcome to episode 40 of Learning Unlocked. Today I am joined by julia.salce, one of our district's instructional specialists, to chat about how the brain learns and how we as teachers can use this knowledge to better plan our lessons, as well as help all students learn. Just a bit about Julia before we begin. This is her 19th year in education. She spent 14 years as a high school ELA teacher. In that time, she was an AP teacher, a department chair, and the district ELA coordinator. However, her passion has always been the art of teaching and learning, not necessarily ELA. She has worked as a professional growth instructional specialist for the last 5 years, providing training to K through 12 teachers in best instructional practices for student learning. She specializes in creating hands-on active learning experiences to achieve all student engagement. However, her recent passion is all things brain science, and how knowing this helps teachers teach and students learn. Julia has been a guest several times on the podcast, so welcome back, Julia.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Really excited to talk about the brain today. It's been something we have both been training on since you've read this book, which we're going to mention in a minute. All throughout the last, I would say 5 trainings, we've done some sort of neuroscience and education training with new teachers, mentor teachers, instructional coaches. So it's a new passion for sure.
It is a new passion. And somehow, because I became so passionate about it, it's what people want to talk to me about. And that's actually been really exciting because it helps me explain everything else I've ever taught people on or trained them on in the past.
Yes, it's also explaining all of our own things in our lives. We'll all of a sudden realize, oh my gosh, that's because the amygdala is having an issue today. And so we're realizing that it not only helps teachers teach, but people function.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, understanding how your brain learns and even just how your brain works is beneficial to every aspect of your life.
Okay, so you read the book. We were calling it the big orange book that Julia carries everywhere with her. And so all of the knowledge that you've gained so far, besides just other research you've done through different articles and magazines, really this is the crux of what made sense to you, right? As far as putting it together with education.
Yes. So I really cannot take credit for anything I will talk about today. It is most likely in this book, Uncommon Sense Teaching, Practical Insights in Brain Science to Help Students Learn. It's by Barbara Oakley and Beth Rogowsky and Terrence Sejnowski. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I messed up those last names, but it is the most accessible brain neuroscience text that I have ever read. And I love the way that they use some different parables to explain different players in the brain. And so, everything I do and everything that I explain to teachers, I really pull from the first 4 chapters of this book are just incredible. The whole book is good, but the first 4 really get you understanding the brain.
Awesome. So today, and I'll link the book into our show notes. So if you want to order it, definitely look into that. But we also are having a book study. So if you're in our district, and you can register for that book study with Julia through Frontline. So we're going to start off with this tale that's in the book. It's called The Parable of the Choir. And it's right straight from the book. And I'm going to have Julia really go through this parable of the choir and explain it because from what I've discussed with Julia, everything kind of goes back to these people, these players, and who they are and what they do in your brain.
Yes. So there are key players in our brain. The first is really the neurons, right? So before we get into the parable, it's important to understand that neurons are the basic building block of this thing we call thought or thinking. When two neurons get close together and share a signal with each other, it's way more complicated than that. But essentially, that's what happened. A thought is formed, a connection is made. And so we need to understand that learning and the process of learning is really about binding these neurons together with that signal and then sending those linked neurons to the right place in the brain. So getting them to these thoughts and these links into the part of the brain that uses or that we store learning is called the long-term memory. And being able to pull them out again is really what we call learning. There's a great quote in the book, and I forget who said it, but learning is not about what we put into the brain, it's what we pull out. We put a lot of stuff into the brain with kids. I've seen pictures where like kids' brains are open and then teachers are just dumping the knowledge in.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And that's not learning. That might be teaching, and I use that very loosely, but it's not learning. Mm-hmm. So this parable really explains what the learning process looks like. So if we understand the basic building block is the neurons, let's talk about the parts of the brain and what they do with these links, with these neurons. So the first thing we have is the working memory. And the working memory is going to be an octopus. Okay, so this octopus has its arms and they're flying around. And this is where we have in the prefrontal cortex. And if you could see me right now, I'm literally like touching my forehead. That's where that prefrontal cortex is. And that's where our octopus lives. And the octopus's job is to catch things flying at it from new information, new learning. And its job is to catch those pieces of information. So you envision a teacher standing at the front of the room, teaching the student something. Every kid has an octopus in their head, arms are flailing, and it catches that learning. The octopus only has so many arms, and not everybody has the same number of arms. And that's really important because we know that different kids are able to pay attention for different amounts of time. And it really is, or how much they're able to take in before they need to process. And that's because everybody has a different capacity that can't be changed. There's nothing we can do to give our octopus more arms. It's what we're born with. It is, we can adapt different parts of our brain to compensate if our octopus isn't so great, but we can't change our octopus. Okay, so we have this octopus, right? It catches the learning, but the problem is that once its arms are full, it has to do one of two things. It has to turn and throw that information, which we'll talk about in a minute, to a different part of the brain, and it has to be given time and opportunity and structure to do that, or it has to drop something to make room to catch the next thing. And the thing is that when we're talking about new learning, it has no conceptual understanding yet of what's in its arms. So it's going to arbitrarily drop things. It's not going to evaluate, I don't really need this, I'm going to drop this to make it just randomly drops things. So when a teacher is teaching, if they do not stop at a certain point, that is kind of the average stopping point, to allow the octopus to turn and do its thing, the kids just start dropping learning to make room for more. What happens then is that you have those experiences where you, as the teacher, like, we just talked about this yesterday. I just told you all of this. And the kids are looking at the teacher like, well, I don't know what happened to it. It's not there. So the teacher has to stop at a certain point in time, which we will talk about in just a second. But the other thing we need to know about the octopus is that the longer we teach, the bigger the gamble we're in. Because the octopus, when distracted, will drop all the balls. So the more balls that we throw at this octopus before we give it time to send that information somewhere else in the brain, the more balls that it has, the more that's going to be lost. When a phone rings or you hear like the, "Excuse me, Mrs. Salce, can you send so-and-so to the office?" Right? All of those disruptions, the fire drill, even just somebody opening the door. Have you ever watched a classroom?
Do that all the time. They come in and out, and everybody's attention.
Everybody turns and looks at the door. Or in Arizona, when it rains, all of a sudden it starts raining outside, and it's literally like the sky is falling.
Actually, the teacher in Arizona drops all the balls because it's raining.
Yeah. Yes. So we really want to be careful that we're not gambling too much with how much we're actually asking this octopus, the prefrontal cortex to hold before we do something with it. Okay, so this octopus has caught the balls, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the second thing that we have is the long-term memory. And this is the neocortex. And I always tell people to envision, and this is how the book describes it, which is what I love. By the way, all of this is from the book. This is me just trying to retell it. The neocortex actually sits like a shower cap on top of the entire surface of the brain. So like this thin tissue that goes in and out of the different ridges. And the neocortex is what houses all of our long-term learning, all of these links, these neurons that have been linked together that the octopus has thrown at the long-term memory. And the long-term memory we refer to as an opera singer. And this opera singer, it's her job to grab these various links. We can think of them like music notes all across the brain that are linked together and send them back to the working memory in some logical or ordered fashion. So it's this, I call it the song of learning. And when the working memory when we need to think about something we've learned before, it is this opera singer's job to sing it back so that the octopus can use it. But here's the thing. When the octopus catches the learning, envision them like balls, right? The octopus is catching tennis balls. But when the octopus turns, it has to do something with those balls in order for the long-term memory to receive it as these musical notes. And what that means is that the students have to stop and engage with the learning in some way. It's more complex than that, but really if it's students stopping and being given an opportunity to make connections to the learning, create images with the learning, talk with other people about the learning. And that turns those balls into something more meaningful that the long-term memory can kind of grasp onto. And so at that point, then the octopus is basically teaching a song to our opera singer. So the problem is remember I said that these links are, that the neocortex is all over the brain. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the links land everywhere. So when we say we're scatterbrained, we absolutely are. They go all over the brain. And so the long-term memory has to practice retrieving this information to know where it's sitting in the brain. I always talk about it's the difference between the first time you try and retrieve information. It's like going across a giant city. We talk about Phoenix all the time, like going from the East Valley all the way over to Glendale using just surface streets. This opera singer is like trying to find the right notes. But the more we retrieve it, the more often we retrieve it, then it kind of creates the freeway. And the opera singer knows exactly where these notes are, how they go together, and can sing it back to the working memory. And so that's the main piece of the parable, but there's one other player, which is really fascinating. Mm-hmm. So if you were to just talk to me about, you have this prefrontal cortex and you have the neocortex, and then there's this hippocampus that's doing this thing, you would have lost me. Mm-hmm. But this book does this parable, right? So we've got the octopus who's conducting this song, sending it back to the opera singer. But at the same time, the octopus is also teaching this guy called the hippocampus, indexing information of this song. So think of it like the trailer pieces of this song. And when the octopus is not busy teaching the long-term memory and the hippocampus, this information, he actually turns and practices the song with the opera singer because she can't remember it at first on her own, but the more she practices, the better she gets. And once she knows the song, she knows it forever. So understanding this allows us as teachers to think about, what does this look like in instruction? Like, how does this help us understand the learning process? And it actually helps us a lot. Right. It helps us make some really important structural decisions to the pattern of how we teach and what we have kids do. And then how we help our opera singer really know this song.
And how for sure. So let's just review for those that are driving, or maybe they're walking, or maybe they're, cleaning their house. If you're not driving right now, because this would be unsafe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But take your hand and put it at the very, very front of your head, your forehead. That is where the octopus lives, correct?
Yep. And this is where conscious thinking happens. Okay. So I always tell people, picture a dog. Where do you see that dog? You literally feel that dog sitting right above your nose in your brain, right? Because that's your prefrontal cortex. That's your octopus.
Okay. So we've got the octopus and you got your hand there. Okay. And then the octopus is catching information. And Julia talked about how that information really, when they catch it, that information comes in the form of, imagine right now a tennis ball being thrown at your octopus. So you would need to catch it with something, right? The catcher's mitts, right? We'll maybe get into that later, but you got to be able to catch it. So your octopus is trying to really catch this information as they're teaching.
Yep.
But it's still living in that long-term memory at the front of your head.
Yeah, in the working memory, the short-term memory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's still living there. So as teachers, would you say that a lot of our time in teaching is kind of just octopusing, which is not a word, but it's just living in this front, front piece, and we're not necessarily giving it enough time to turn, do something,
and send it to the long-term memory.
And then send it to the long-term memory, who is the octopus singer.
Right.
Okay.
So when we tell teachers, like when teachers are told, you can't lecture the whole time, you can't talk the whole time.
Right.
There's a reason. Right now, it's not just about like, oh, this person doesn't like that I lecture, or this person doesn't believe in lectures. No, it's that this goes through college. This is not just kids. Right. And I think we tend to think that way, but we know if who's in meetings and they're talking too long, we're gone.
We're done. Yeah.
So the science behind it says that you can only throw so many balls at that octopus before it starts having to drop information. So we need to, as teachers, stop talking, and we get the guide is around their age in minutes. That's your average amount of time that the octopus can kind of catch information, and then they have to do something with it, and we call those active learning experiences.
Okay. So let's, like, for example, I'm teaching kindergartners. Okay. I'm a kindergarten teacher, and they are 5 and 6. And so when I'm teaching something, I've got their octopus. The octopus is working. It's catching the balls. At around 4 to 5 minutes, really, I have to stop because they're now going to start dropping balls arbitrarily and not knowing which is really the most important pieces I'm giving them. So they do need to stop and do something. I think a lot of teachers are like, wait, what? I got to do something every 5 minutes? It seems overwhelming, but the thing that they can turn and do doesn't have to be super long, does it?
No, it does not.
Okay.
And the same thing goes like with kindergartners, the thing they do would be relatively short.
Right. Because
their attention span on the doing of that thing will get in the way as well. I love kindergarten as an example because what's beautiful about them is they show you when their octopus is full, like when the arms are full, they literally start squirming and turning and moving because they have all this stuff and they don't know what to do with it.
Right.
But as kids get older, they're very good at the affect of school, and they can trick you into thinking like they do the head nod, the automatic head nod. And you have that sweet little girl in class that always smiles when you look her way. But really, if you see behind the scenes, like their octopus is like, I'm full, stop. Right. And it has to start throwing things away. So I love kindergarten too, because I talk a lot about, we love to read little kids stories.
Right.
And they come to the mat and we read them the story. But we need to think about how long that story is taking.
Yeah.
And so, kindergarten teachers, they adapt so easily.
Amazingly.
Yes. But a really good example is, okay, I'm reading this story and we're working on what the character's feeling at different times. So we're trying to understand this story and the emotions of the character. Traditionally, what you would see is the teacher would sit on the floor and read the entire story, which might take anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes if she's stopping to show the pictures and point out, right? The problem with that is that their octopus is taking in this story, taking in this information, and it can only take in so much. And so if you're really wanting to talk about the details of the story, you need to stop at 5 minutes. You could do one of two things. Okay, everybody, we're going to turn to our buddy, and you have assigned buddies on the circle mat, whatever. And we're going to tell our buddy what we think this character is feeling right now. So turn to your buddy and tell him what this and why. right? Right there, they've engaged with it. They've thought about it. She might then ask for a few responses, and then they go on in the story.
So what's happening in the brain at that moment when she does stop and say, hey, turn to your buddy?
So at that point in time, the octopus is being given an opportunity to do its thing, to turn the ball into these linkable notes, these music notes for the opera singer.
Okay.
And then it can throw those notes, free up its arms, and then it's ready to go. Also, in that time, kids will naturally, and then we can also prompt them to make connections to prior learning, which allows the octopus not only to make that learning this linkable note, but actually to link it to notes that already exist in the long-term memory.
Which is going to strengthen their understanding of what they're currently engaged in.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and it's that easy. That's all. And then go on with the story.
Yeah.
It's the same thing if you're talking about an 11th grade social studies teacher.
Right.
Like, yes, teaching the history is necessary, right? Telling the story of history or talking about all the different wars and all the different players. Social studies teachers are some of the greatest storytellers I've ever known.
Yeah.
But the problem is traditionally, and I'm stereotyping here, but traditionally in that environment, the kids are taking notes.
Right.
They're writing down, maybe they're writing from the board or they're copying the fill in the blank pieces as the information is being given. And no matter how engaging it is, like you can keep their attention, but you can't necessarily guarantee retention.
Right.
So if you're a great storyteller, they're with you. They're following the story, but they're not necessarily going to be able to retain that. So if I'm a social studies teacher, that means that, let's say I'm an 11th grade social studies teacher, my kids are about 16 years old. I'm going to stop somewhere around 14 minutes because we can say 16 minutes, but really 15. You don't want to go over 15, even if you're with adults.
Yeah, I was going to say adults, really 15 is kind of the max anyways.
Right.
So.
And the thing is that this is like their average at their prime. So if you teach a 0 hour with kids, like adolescents at 6:30 in the morning are not at their prime.
Yeah.
We might need to back that time up.
Right.
But anyway, you're going to stop. You've been telling the story, you've been doing this, and you're going to do something. It could be you've given them a sentence frame. Like, okay, I want you guys in your notes, I want you to very quickly process off to the side, or maybe you've left them a spot, which we're going to talk about later, but you're going to give them an opportunity to actually work with that information. They could discuss it with someone. It could be a STEM that says, at this point in time, my understanding of, and insert what topic it is, reminds me of some blah, 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 right? And then they could turn and share, and then you can go on. Like there's this thought that the active learning experience has to be like them getting up and running around and doing something in this big grand show. No, there are levels. There are incremental levels of these active learning experiences. Should they get up?
Yeah.
Sure. Should they move at some point in time? Yes. Do they have to do it every time? No, that would be ridiculous. You would never get anything done. Right. So the idea is know the brain, know the limits of the octopus, and give the octopus an opportunity to turn that information into something linkable for the long-term memory.
Right. Because our ultimate goal, like you said at the very beginning from that quote, is to be able to have the kids then get the octopus to sing the song so they can pull it out of their head when they need it and retrieve it when they need it.
Yeah. And use it with other new learning.
Right.
Because that's where critical thinking starts coming in. When the opera singer can sing back this song and this song and this song, and the octopus has some new nuggets of learning, and all of a sudden there's this amalgamation of thinking happening in that working memory. That's critical thinking.
Well, and that's why synthesis and summarization are really difficult for students that haven't had this practice, because they're not used to pulling all of those different things forward. And then this also really does trip kids up in math when things do build. Right. And we know that they need to have these things that they got to be able to pull. The opera singer needs to sing those songs so they can continue on in that progression.
They need that skill set and that conceptual understanding. Absolutely.
All right. So quickly, I know we just kind of went over some examples, but like really, if you could just explain, how the brain learns. And I think what's really important here is just really that whole idea of what we were talking about, the entry points of learning, that declarative pathway versus the procedural pathway. I think that's also really important
Yep.
for them to know. And then we can get into some like specific strategies that can help them do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I just described, that parable of the choir where you have this octopus who catches the balls, turns, engages with that information, sends it to the opera singer, and then she can sing it back when the time comes. Our hippocampus is there to practice. Hip, by the way, does a lot of his practice when kids are sleeping. And then anytime they're transitioning from one activity or piece of learning to another, that hip will take his time to process. So that's what we call the declarative pathway. Okay. That's what when we think about teaching, that's what people envision. Like, I'm the teacher and I'm giving you things, you're consciously thinking about it, and then, you're throwing it into your long-term memory. The procedural pathway is the second way we learn. So that one is subconscious. So you're not actively thinking about it. The procedural pathway, so the declarative comes through the working memory. So it comes through our octopus. The procedural information comes through processing that's happening in the basal ganglia, which is the scariest thing I've ever read. I'm like, the basal, what right? And it's this set of structures in the brain that that's responsible for many things, but for sensory processing is a piece of that. So whenever kids are doing, rather than like hearing, receiving, but whenever they're active in their learning, they're engaging the senses, that sensory system will start to identify subconsciously relationships and patterns in what they're doing. And it will build its own learning links, its own music notes, basically, for the long-term memory based on what it sees. So, for example, and these links are really strong. Procedural learning is really, really strong.
But you said it takes longer, though. Like, the declarative is weaker,
but immediate. And the procedural takes longer, but it's stronger. So longer and stronger. The other one's quicker, but weaker.
Okay.
So what happens is, think about like when kids learn to speak, when we learn to speak. A lot of what we do in those first 5 or 6 years is actually through our procedural pathway, because they don't have a fully developed working memory, right? That's why they don't start school until a certain age.
Well, it's also why you don't show your baby flashcards of words.
Right. It's nothing's going to happen there, right?
Yeah, your declarative pathway as a 2-year-old, it means that you pick up language
developed
procedurally, right?
Yeah, it's all happening through your experience, your exposure to it, and in this case, like the auditory exposure. And what's really cool is we don't sit down and teach our 3-year-old that we say like a subject-verb pattern when we speak. They naturally, through the procedural pathway, start to recognize these patterns in language, and they say like first like, I hungry. Right. And then after a year, we don't say to many of our kids, and actually they encourage you not to, we don't say, no, it's say, I am hungry. I am hungry. We don't do that. We just know they say, I hungry. And over time, they hear us speaking and they recognize, and all of a sudden the word am appears. Right. And so this is the procedural pathway, recognizing that there's some relationships and patterns to what they're hearing. And, in other situations, it could be what they're feeling, what they're seeing. And that's procedural learning. It's really cool, actually, that our brain can do that it can have this subconscious loop. Driving home. When you first move to a new house, you have to consciously think about how to get home. Okay, especially if you're hardwired to turn right out of your parking lot at work, and now you have to turn left, right? Because you'll catch yourself. That you have to actively think about it. But once you've driven home on that route so many times, you end up in those situations where sometimes you get home and you've been thinking about something else and you don't even remember making the choice to turn, to move into this lane and go around this person. Stop at a stoplight, right? All of that is procedural. It's habitual. It's automatic. And so that is, until there's an accident.
Right.
And you have to navigate around it. And then all of a sudden your octopus has to come back on and figure out how to navigate you home, make some conscious choices. So that's procedural learning. And procedural learning is stronger. It's really hard to break. Your working memory, the octopus cannot create procedural links. It can only come through the basal ganglia, through that pathway. but it can use procedural links to pull forward into its brain to think about other things.
Okay.
So that's why we can start talking to kids about, we can declaratively teach them nouns and adjectives and those types of things. And then they can take their procedural knowledge of the pattern and language, and then they can start to put 2 and 2 together. So those are the 2 learning pathways.
Okay.
You need both.
Right.
To learn. So we tend to, in school, we're really good at least the first step of the declarative pathway, which is giving the octopus stuff.
Right. Gotta give you the knowledge. We gotta disseminate the information that you need to know as a student.
Yes.
That's our job.
Yes. Because we cannot directly control the basal ganglia and the procedural pathway. We have a tendency in education to not trust learning that happens that way because we can't control it. There's kind of like a leap of faith, like in math facts. If I don't give you flashcards, right, or I don't spend time having you memorize 2 + 2 is 4,
right?
Instead, I've been told as the teacher, we're supposed to do these manipulatives. We're supposed to do these like little math grids. We're supposed to do these visual pieces, and trust that exposure to that eventually will teach the procedural links that 2 + 2 = 4 are going to happen that way, which means they're stronger and they're automatic. You don't have to recall 2 + 2 is 4. You will habitually know 2 + 2 is 4
based on that basal ganglia working in the procedural pathway, just like trying to get home.
Right.
It's just there.
It's just automatic.
And now our octopus can pull it.
Yep. And then that means that we can go on to more advanced math that uses these math facts, and we don't have to think about it. We have to count on our fingers. We don't have to do that.
Right.
It's just there.
So let's just, and I'm sidebarring off of our questions, but let's just talk quickly about so the idea of studying, go home and study, because we were just talking about flashcards.
Yeah.
So many students, our kids included, our daughters are, how old is your daughter?
11.
Okay.
You're just 10.
I almost said 11.
They just turned. Yeah.
Okay. 11 and 10. They just
old.
We don't like it.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're like, if they were told by their teachers to go home and study, and
mine has been.
Yes. And mine has been too. And both of them will come home and they won't have much written down to look at. Maybe they have a textbook to go through. Maybe they do have some flashcards. They study. They take the test and they don't do as well.
Yep.
So what's happening there?
Yeah, it's sad. So being a parent has been the most eye-opening experience on the other side of learning, watching it from the home perspective,
right?
And watching my own kid. So a great example is like last year, my daughter had to study for a social studies test, and they were told to go home and study. And the teacher did what most teachers do. There was a review game in class, and there was that type of thing. But ultimately, they were told to go home and study. So I knew, because it was written in her agenda, that she had to study for her test the next day. Okay. So she opens up her notebook, and there's maybe 3 or 4 words and lines for this whole unit in social studies. So there's nothing to look for there. I'm like, okay, what else do you have? Because that's not going to help us.
Yeah.
What else do you have? She pulls out this big old textbook. And it was actually a textbook workbook. So their social studies curriculum last year is they had to open up this workbook, and it was theirs. And she said, I need to study all the highlighted stuff. Well, I looked, and every page was pink. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't originally pink, but it was pink. And I'm like, Katie, and she goes, well, it was supposed to highlight the most important things. And she goes, I thought it all was important. Right. And I'm like, that's logical. So we ended up in this situation where I had to go through her chapter. She had to read it over and over, or she had been reading it and banging her head against the wall because I would quiz her and she didn't know it.
Right.
And ultimately what happens is we have these kids and we tell them to go home and study, and they do. Like, for the most part, kids naturally want to be successful. They want to please their teacher. They want to do things the right way. We accuse them of not studying, because what happens is they go home and they study and they stare at their book for a while. Yep. They reread it.
They reread their notes.
Yep. They reread again, and they know it
at that moment.
Yes. Because who knows it? The octopus.
The octopus knows it.
The octopus knows it. The problem with the octopus is the minute that kid closes their book, puts their stuff away, and goes on to dinner, maybe TV, sleep, the octopus has dropped that information. The hippocampus might have a little of it, might have caught a little of it from the octopus. And that's where you get, they can do some of it. But ultimately, kids go in the next day and they don't do well on the test. Mm-hmm. And they're like, I studied.
Right.
And the teacher's like, you couldn't have studied. And mom and dad are at home going, yeah, I watched them study. Uh-huh. Knowing this, I had to help my daughter last year.
Right.
And so I had to teach her how to do retrieval practice.
Right.
Because that's what studying really means. Somewhere along the line, most of us got through college and survived learning because we learned we had to self-quiz.
Right.
As we were studying, we learned that just reading it wasn't going to do it.
Mm-hmm. And we have a lot to think of our hippocampus.
Yes.
Is really what it is.
Yes.
We put enough into the hippocampus and then kind of self-taught to make it through.
Yes.
Because I definitely walked into college not knowing how to study at all.
No, most don't. And actually, I'm hoping I'm not misspeaking, but if I recall correctly, Barbara Oakley's work on teaching people the brain was actually a course she designed for college students to help them study better.
Oh, really?
And that's kind of what
and then
prompted
it kind of launched into
this bigger scale. And then she connected with people in education, and they were able to kind of put the pieces together. But yeah, your hippocampus is the one to thank when you memorize everything the day before the test and you go in and you ace it. And then 2 days later, if you were given the same test, you'd flunk completely because the hippocampus kept enough to get by, but it doesn't store. It's not a storage place. Okay. You got to get it into Neo, the opera singer.
You got to get it to the opera singer.
Yeah. So what am I going to say to teachers? Stop telling kids to go home to study. Yeah. That should be a no
sentence.
Yes.
But we're going to give you some things to tell them instead.
Yes.
Okay, but before we do that, I think we've made a case for why is it so important for teachers to know this about the brain. Okay?
Yeah.
But I really want you to do the analogy of the mechanic because I think that really does hit home, why this is so crucial. And then I do want to talk about not only does it help all kids, but it helps a lot of kids with other learning disabilities and ADHD.
Yeah. So I forget who I heard it from. Again, it wasn't me, but I thought that's brilliant. So I use it. It's the idea that when you take your car to the shop, there is this assumption that the mechanic knows how the engine works, right? It would be impossible for them to actually, yes, you can hook it up to a computer, but to actually fix the problem, they have to know where things are and what leads to what and what not to touch, right? The brain is the same for teachers. Parents send their kids to school assuming that we know how to teach their kids.
Right.
Well, in assuming that, then we need to know how the brain works. Or we're just like a mechanic, blindly reaching around trying to make things happen in the engine.
Right.
And it doesn't go well. So it is important for teachers to understand how the brain works because it really should drive how we teach. Mm-hmm. And then how we ask kids to pull learning forward again.
And just like a mechanic gets a variety of different cars that they have to work on.
So true. Yes.
Right? I mean, it comes in and it's a Honda. It comes in and it's a Ford. It comes in and it's a sports car. It's a truck. It's a whatever. And just like that, teachers get kids that have neurodivergent brains. I mean, we all get kids that are not not every car that pulls into our parking lot for the mechanic is a Toyota.
Yep.
So we got to be able to work with all these different types of octopi and all these brains that come to us. So all this knowledge about the brain can really help all those kids.
Yes. And that's something you and I specifically are passionate about because we have children with ADHD.
Yes.
And this is one of those things that, and ADHD is directly connected to the two learning pathways.
Right.
So for me, it fascinates me and it helps me as a mom, helps me also as a person with ADHD to really understand what's happening in my brain.
Right.
And it makes the case again because really what kids with ADHD need besides executive functioning skill
Right.
support.
Yeah.
In the learning environment, they just need time to let their octopus throw the balls into the long-term memory. They need time to engage with the learning.
Right.
And so when we do that pattern of teach for about their age in minutes, then give them an active learning experience, teach for about their age in minutes, another active learning experience, we're not only supporting the neurotypical brain,
Right.
we're supporting the neurodivergent brains as well,
Right.
because it's using both pathways. And I forget which way it goes, but I know kids with dyslexia, kids with ADHD, it's that they rely more heavily on one pathway over the other. I can't recall which one it is at this time, but if we don't ever get to that other pathway,
yeah,
then there's a problem, right? Then the learning's not as strong for them. So,
and then they also need, I think we've got that pattern of teach, octopus is going, it catches the information. Okay, now it's going to take a break. It's going to throw that information into Neo with doing some type of active learning experience. It's okay then to even insert some metacognition, some reflection.
Right.
This is where like wait time and think time and all those things that we are, are essentials that we consider essentials to good instruction are so important, because you're getting all those kids now back and ready to, their octopus is like, okay,
yeah,
I've practiced. I've thought about it. I reflected. I'm ready to catch more information.
Yes. And we have to remember that not everybody's not everybody's arms move at the same speed.
Yes.
Either,
right.
Right. Like, so part of like with ADHD, part of it is that their octopus is maybe 2 steps behind. Like the ball's floating, waiting to be caught.
Right.
Right. And you just have to catch up. And that wait time, that think time allows for that.
Them to catch it. Right. Okay. All right. So knowing all of this now about the brain, what would be the optimal way for teachers to use note-taking in class?
Yeah, that's a passion topic of mine.
Because it happens. Teachers want to make sure kids have notes to go home and study, which we're never going to say again,
we'll
listeners.
Do something else in a little bit. Yeah.
But, they want them to have the information. And the typical way that we do that is by having kids take notes. But what is the optimal way now that we know this stuff about the brain?
Yeah. So the first thing is, and I'm just going to say this as a parent who experiences the frustration of this, you cannot send a kid home to study their notes if you cannot guarantee that everybody's notes are the same.
Ooh,
that everybody you cannot send a kid home to study their notes if you haven't ensured that every kid's notes are the same, that everybody has the essential information written down. Because I know I get that, like the gut mentality of the teachers, well, if they would just pay attention in class and write down what I tell them to, they would all have the notes. They had equal access to the information.
Yes.
But not every brain is the same. We go back to what you said about the different cars, like a mechanic has to be able to work on different cars, which, side note, I did not know that. Until my Honda broke down this summer in the middle of nowhere, and there was not a Honda dealer, so I just went to a mechanic, and I go, well, I don't do Hondas.
Right.
I'm like, what?
Yeah.
So coming back in, then if not every brain is the same, they're not going to their octopus is not going to catch all the same information. Plus, I mean, I remember being in the classroom giving notes, and because by the way, Britt and I will admit we have done all of these things.
Yes.
And the kid raising their hand, oh, Miss Salce, can you go back? I didn't get that written down. So we have kids who are trying to write everything down. We have kids who are like, I don't even know what to write down, so I'm not writing anything down. And then you have kids that are falling somewhere in the middle, but they're not catching it all. So I would say, get that out of the way. Give kids the notes. Right? And right now I can see some teachers are thinking but then why would they even have to listen to me? They have all the information. Why would they even? Well, because you're going to make them engage with the notes. Right. So a really good note-taking practice is something that I call link it, learn it, log it. So begin any lesson. So I remember in my teaching training, the KWL chart. That was the stupidest thing in the world. And for the longest time, I didn't put any value in it. I never used it. I was like, it's a chart. Why? This is a waste of time. With the letters
K, W, and L. Is this supposed to be? It just didn't seem an engaging strategy. Yeah. So it's I don't really want to use that.
So I never used it. But really what it was doing, and any type of prior knowledge activity, is priming the neurons in the octopus. Okay, I think Britt, you made the analogy of it like it puts catcher's mitts on the octopus's arms, right? Like it gives the octopus a better chance of catching the learning in the right way,
right?
And it makes filing that learning away easier because you've pulled front to your conscious thinking those neural links that are going to deal with what's coming,
right?
Okay, so link it. Do some type of prior knowledge activity. It could be like a quick topic storm, or it could be a quick brain dump about a topic. What's everything that you know? It could be a lot of different things. And then get to the note taking. Give them the notes.
Just give it to them.
Give it to them. Everything you need them to know, give it to them. But leave space between chunks of it. Mm-hmm. So you can look at that information and you can say, okay, this is probably going to take me about 8 or 9 minutes. This is a natural place to stop. I'm going to put a box here. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I like to put a little cog wheel in that box so that it's like a signal, dual coding for kids that this is our processing area.
This is our time to pause and process.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So while you're talking, you encourage them to underline anything. And you might say while you're speaking, hey, in your notes, if I were you, I would like super underline this word because it's going to come up a million times. Actually, let's stop and define it off to the side, right?
Right.
You can do those types of things. But ultimately, when you get to that stopping point, you've filled the octopus with information. Now give kids an opportunity in the notes to do a processing activity. It could be a sentence stem. It could be a visual. It could be a quick thinking map. Mm-hmm. It could be a turn and talk with a partner, and then they write down new things they've learned.
Right.
It really doesn't matter, but it's their processing. Could be
the think, pair, share, which so many of us have been taught to use. But it never, for me, was ever successful because I would say, okay, now let's do a think, pair, share. And the kids would just be like, okay. And they would just turn and talk. Mm-hmm. Instead of thinking first, it could really be the boxes. Hey, think, put it in the box. Okay, now let's pair and share.
Yes.
Right? So it's just it's things we already do.
Right.
It's just we're inserting them strategically.
Yes, because we understand how the brain learns.
Right.
Right. So you've linked it, you do that throughout the learning process, the stopping and processing, the learn it piece. And then at the end, you do the log it, which is a culminating synthesis or summary activity to encapsulate what they feel they've taken away from that. So it's basically setting the brain up for the pruning that's going to occur later. Because when you sleep and when you're relaxed, your brain, when you're not using stuff or it doesn't seem as important, your brain will go in and naturally cut the links, break the links on the neurons. It's called pruning because then it frees up those neurons for other learning.
Right.
And so when you do that synthesizing activity, that summary activity, it kind of helps the brain know what you feel after all of this are kind of the important pieces.
Okay. So that's link it, learn it, and log it. And we're going to go ahead and link that system to the show notes. So if listeners are like, oh, I want to try that, they can.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's now talking about notes. I think a lot of our early childhood may have checked out. Mm-hmm. They may be like, I don't give notes to a first grader. I don't give notes to a kindergartner, but they can still do the link it, learn it, log it process. Could you just give a quick example of how a first grade teacher could use link it, learn it, log it?
Yeah. So let's say that we're in math. I'm going to make a math example up off the top of my head here, but
you go, girl.
We're in math and we are about to work on addition, some element of addition. I'm not a math teacher, so just forgive my lingo here, but we're going to work on some element of addition, but we're going to start with a link it. So we're going to start with kids thinking about, hey, boys and girls, why don't you think about when you got in the car today? When you get in the car, how many things do you have in one hand and how many things do you have in the other? Or how many things was your mom carrying? How many things were you carrying? Right. And they can turn to your partner and talk about how many things you were carrying. How many things would that be in your car then? On your way to school.
Right.
And they start thinking about that, how they see things and how they come together and they add up into bigger amounts of things.
And not only are you doing linking it, you're pulling in their knowledge of numbers, but you're also pulling in some relevance.
Right.
Right. Interest. Also, like, gosh, my mom carries a lot of drinks into work.
Yeah. Right.
She had coffee and a water and a water for later, right? But yeah, you're pulling all that stuff. Okay, so they're linking it, but something just verbal. They don't need to be writing anything necessarily. They could just be talking.
Think time, and then they're talking, they're sharing. Okay, and then you start the teaching process. You start working with some conceptual understanding, or maybe you're working with the what are they called? The number pyramids. I forget.
Yep.
And you're showing that. They should have whatever you're showing on the board, they should have in front of them. Right. You should have like that information. It may not make sense to them until you go over it, but they have it down in front of them to reference. Then you stop and you take out the math manipulatives, right? So you've taught them this, the visual, the number pyramid, whatever I said. And then they're working with the manipulatives. And they're processing, okay, when we have 4 and we have 5 and we put them together, we end up with 9. And then we start to look at we start to pick up on relationships, whether we realize it or not. And then you go back and you start the next piece, right? Or they do some additional individual practice and then they go back to learn it again and they process, but they have all of it to reference back to and they have opportunities to process. And then the last piece is log it. Yeah. So you might end with a return back to the link it, right? So tomorrow morning, I want you to carry 3 things to the car and ask your mom how many things she's going to carry and I want you to add them together. Right. Let's log all of that understanding. Let's come back full circle. And then let's talk about what does addition do? Can you describe for me? What do we do when we're adding? Right. And turn to your partner and describe. Or you could say if adding were a toy, what toy does it look like to you and why? Why does it look like that toy?
Yep. And I think, kids might say marbles because there's several marbles and we have to add them together, whatever. Yeah. And then you're really getting into that critical thinking piece is what you're trying to get them in that habit of. Right.
It would be the Connect 4 game. It would be that, right? And some of them will look at you like, I don't know what.
Yeah, but then you help them out. Right. Yeah. Yep. Then you help them out and you get them there. And the more they do that type of thinking and learning, the easier it will become for those kids. Yes. And of course, you would give them ample wait time, ample think time to discuss, so that you do get all the kids. Like you grab all of them and you're not leaving those kids that are like, I feel super behind. I have no idea what's going on. Yeah. Right. But then you're having enough engaging activities for those kids that are like, I got this. We're good. Right. Maybe they're, drawing a picture that represents as well as, the number of things that they've carried into the car. Right. So you can kind of manipulate that and go from, your top kiddos to the ones that maybe are a little bit needing more support. So, okay. So that's link it, learn it, log it. Now we're going to go to Julia's favorite thing.
Blind brain dump.
Is the blind brain dump. So we've given you that strategy. We have one more strategy for you about based on how we talked about the brain learning, what's something else that they can do. And this is really where we're going to talk about that retrieval. That's so important.
Yeah, we're going to come back to, because we promised we would, what we do instead of study.
Yes.
Right? So the link it, learn it, log it strategy is something to do while you're teaching, right? It's a way to engage students during instruction. The blind brain dump can be both. So the blind brain dump is really simple. At any point in time after you've been learning something, it could be that there's time between it, or it could be immediately after you've taught something. Ideally, you do it with a little bit of time between it. So maybe it's like yesterday we learned this and we come into class the next day and this is the activity. Or earlier in the lesson we learned this, but we've gone on to do these things.
Yeah.
So the blind brain dump is simply and it's no setup by the teacher. You just give them blank space, either on a blank piece of paper or scratch paper, or it could even be a dry erase board. And you give them a set amount of time and you say, okay, boys and girls, I want you to brain dump everything you can remember about whatever the topic is. Yeah. And you can even give them a picture. A picture that you'd use, the dual coding. Yeah. Everything you remember about this, and you put it up on the screen.
Right. I was talking, we were doing this, activity the other day, and I had this image. What do you remember about? What was going on then?
Yeah. Dump it.
Dump it.
And they can do that in pictures and words, or just words, or
graphic organizer, whatever they choose. Okay.
So you give a set amount of time. They've brain dumped. They're not using any notes. That's the blind part. Okay. So there are brain dumps where you kind of brain dump everything, but you can use some supports. But the blind brain dump is a true retrieval practice. What is in the long-term memory. What is in Neo is what we call our opera singer.
Basically,
what can she do?
The blind brain dump is really activating our opera singer to sing the notes to the octopus.
Yeah, so they can write them. You can write them down.
Yes.
Okay. So after that's done, then you have students grab a different color pen, and this is really important because this is great visual activity for the students and for the teacher.
Okay.
So you have them grab a different color pen, and you do one of two things. You can make the next step, like maybe you don't want them interacting with their partners at this time. You just want them to go back. You can then have them go back and look in their notes because they all have the same notes, and put onto their blind brain dump everything that they forgot, that didn't come forward, and they can see it now in that second color. Who else can see it in that second color? The teacher.
So it's a great formative assessment.
Yes.
It should not be graded.
No.
It should not be high stakes because I don't want a kid to all of a sudden be like, I had 4 things written down and now my second color is like 15. Mm-hmm. It's not supposed to be a gotcha. Mm-hmm. And that needs to also, I think, be clear to kids.
You have to create that culture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like this color thing is not to be like, oh, well, you only have, so much or whatever. Right. It's really supposed to be a aha moment for you and an aha moment for me as the teacher.
As a teacher, I can walk around, and if I see that everybody has this particular concept in their second color,
right,
I'm going to know right away that I need to rec and reteach that. So if you had kids collaborate first and share what they came up with, that could be in one color.
Okay.
And then if they go to their expert resource, which is the notes or the textbook, that could be in a third color.
Okay.
So it's just color coding the layers of retrieval that are happening. So that is, if you know as a teacher that you're going to be giving a test on Friday, and it's Monday, on the cell, something about the cell in biology.
Yeah.
A great thing to do, if you have class time, do the blind brain dumps in class.
Right.
But if you're, they've got to do some of it at home, don't say go home and study. Say go home, take this piece of paper, and tonight set a timer for 10 minutes. Okay, because maybe you want to give them it's extensive, or it could be 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I want you to write down on that piece of paper, don't use anything else, what you know and remember about the cell. They come into class they do that, and it's not going to be graded. I just want to see what you remember.
Right.
They come into class on Tuesday, and they either collaborate with a partner, use that second color.
It'd be a great bell work or a warm up. Mm-hmm.
And they use that second color. They look at their notes. They see, they fill in what they were missing. Now they have a visual cue of what they didn't remember. Also, they're having aha moments. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Right. So they're practicing that, which they realize, oh yeah, that was in there. Or I have no recollection
idea what that is.
Right? We talked about that. And those are opportunities they can ask for help. So then Tuesday night, you send them home to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And they come in, same thing.
Yep.
Now you show them side by side.
Right.
Look at yesterday's, look at today's. There's less of that second color.
Right.
Okay. What you can do all week is that same thing. Mm-hmm. Because what you're doing is you've taught them how to do retrieval practice for studying. Mm-hmm. You can do that in class. You can start class with a brain dump.
Right.
And then because homework is not always the best thing. So you can do it that way in class and then have them do the coloring. But either way, what you're doing is you're creating the freeways to the information.
And you're building their capacity as a learner to understand how their brain works in terms of what they can and cannot remember.
Yes.
And that's a life skill.
That is a life skill.
So the blind brain dump is super powerful. Mm-hmm. So we'll also make sure we link a resource for that as well. Okay.
Love it. I love it.
I know, it's Julia's favorite.
Yes.
And so this is the stat that I think is my favorite stat that you have given me over the last few weeks. Mm-hmm. So 60% of the brain is designated to visual processing, and the brain processes visuals 60,000 times faster than text. So along with the strategies we discussed today, we had Link It, Learn It, Log It, and the blind brain dump. What would be your recommendation to teachers to help to make sure that they engage the brain with visuals?
So you should be dual coding everything.
Okay.
Like everything that you can possibly put in dual coding is just putting images along with information.
Or a movement, right?
Yeah, it can be a movement, but if we want to harness that 60% of the brain,
it really needs to be a visual.
They usually talk about it in terms of visuals.
Okay.
But yes, dual coding simply means like two pathways to the information.
Okay.
So when we do whole brain stuff and we do movements with it,
right.
we really are with the movement creating a visual. If you think about it.
In their own,
in their mind,
of their own body. Yeah.
Yes. So the dual coding is going to allow them to access that information in multiple ways. It's going to speed up their understanding as well, because you're using more of the brain, and the brain is processing that information faster.
Okay.
So use it with everything from your agendas for the day. Like you should have images that correspond. They know exactly when they see that image, oh, it's time to do this, or they'll do that faster than stopping and reading directions on a screen. To everything that you're teaching should have corresponding visuals.
And this is why, and when I was talking to a teacher about this the other day, I said, well, think about, when you go into your Google Drive and you're looking for a Google Doc in a folder, your brain already knows Google Doc is blue. It looks like a piece of paper.
Yep.
And that's what dual coding is. It makes it faster for you to find things in your Google Drive because it's coded for you.
Right.
They did that. They understand how the brain works as a company. So they figured it out.
They understand probably too much.
Yeah, it's probably that they know too much. But so as a teacher, even like if I'm thinking for secondary teachers, even with like Google Classroom or any of those types of things. It works both in paper form, note form, but also in the digital world. Like put the visuals so they can see, oh, when I see that light bulb in Google Classroom, that means this. That's a reminder. Right. If I see that piece of paper, that means assignment. Like it just will make them process your stuff and find it faster.
Yeah, and you can do it. We ended up doing it in our Google Calendar. For the Google calendar we created and shared with our new teachers for the year, is we did an emoji add-on, and then we were able to add little images next to each type of thing. So if we had a half day, it was this image that went with the words half day. But when you saw that image, you know,
remembered.
Same thing if there's something coming up or some class, there might be like the discussion bubbles for that. So yeah, dual coding works everywhere. It's easy to do. You can look for those add-ons digitally, but really you should be teaching everything with a corresponding visual, whether it's an analogy visual, or the actual thing.
Yeah. Some type of, and it could even be simple as like a symbol, just to make sure that they understand like that just correlates together. Okay, so we've talked about the brain and how it learns, and the octopus, the opera singer, hip, which we all love. And it's all from this book. So we talked about Uncommon Sense Teaching. We're going to link that. But there's one more brain research book that you like. It's called The Brain Rules. Can you just quickly talk about that? And then we also love Kate Jones's Retrieval Practice book too. So let's kind of make sure we hit those before we wrap up.
Yep. So John Medina has a book out called Brain Rules, and it's 12 principles for surviving and thriving at work, home, and school. And basically what his book does is it goes through the 12 brain rules, and it talks about the brain rules for survival, for memory, for wiring, stress, sleep, exercise, and basically all those things and their impact on the brain and how understanding that can make you more productive or make you better at school or just in general, an overall more productive and successful human being. And so he has these 12 brain rules, and he explains the research, but he also tells a lot of stories
which is
that
nice.
Go along with it, which is nice. So
it makes it a quicker read. It's not super researchy.
Yes. And I would say Brain Rules and Uncommon Sense Teaching are both books that you could just sit down and read through.
They're very accessible.
Very accessible. I have teachers that have taken me up on saying like this Uncommon Sense Teaching is my favorite book ever. And they come back and say, I got it after your training and I read it in a day.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
I'm glad you have time like that. And that's awesome. Like I couldn't put it down. I'm like,
and now they're applying it with their teaching, which is awesome.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's Kate Jones' Retrieval Practice book. We love Kate Jones' stuff. She may not be as well known to people, so I want to make sure they know that her stuff is out there. And